today. I hope I can be as inspiring as Saba makes me sound. But yeah, and also just thank you for the Future for Nature Foundation, the selection committee, for choosing me as one of the winners. So as Saba mentioned, I work with seabirds. I am part of the Albatross Task Force, or as I like to call us, Unstoppable Task Force, because I do not think we cannot achieve anything if we don't try. And so I'm going to talk you through how we conserve seabirds, starting locally with my country in South Africa, and then how we're going abroad. So just to put you in perspective, I obviously come from Africa. I'm born in South Africa, as she said, in Johannesburg, a city-bound place. I have since moved to Cape Town and been lucky enough to be near the ocean, and that's right down at the bottom here of Africa. When you immediately think of Africa, you often think of these creatures: cheetahs, lions, elephants, rhinos. And as Saba mentioned, I was incredibly lucky that my parents brought me up in an environment very much like this. I was taken on many family holidays out into nature where I could just appreciate it and have a lot to learn from nature itself. You really can learn a lot when you just take a little time out and to just look at what nature has to offer us. But many people don't really think of Africa as a place where we find beautiful, majestic seabirds such as these. The wandering albatross that Saba was talking about is this one at the top here. But we have many, many different types of species. But I'm going to focus the rest of my talk on the albatross because they are the most endangered and threatened species. So as you can see, they're a majestic, iconic, magnificent species. They're very similar to humans. They can live very long. Many of them are over 60 years of age. And incredibly, last year on Midway Atoll in Hawaii, an albatross laid an egg at the age of 62 and successfully reared one of her chicks. She has laid over 40 eggs in her lifetime, has been very successful when bringing a chick into the world. Albatrosses need both parents to bring up their chick, so while one is feeding, the other one is looking after the chick, and they reverse roles. So they breed very slowly because it takes both of them to bring up one individual. They only lay one egg every year or every 2 years. When they reach adulthood, there's not a lot that will affect them. So it's really when they're young and a little bit stupid that we have problems with these birds. They also travel incredibly large distances, as Saba mentioned. Can you imagine having to travel 10,000 kilometers in one trip to feed your chick? Just once. And maybe having to do that again to find enough food for your family. These birds do that regularly, and they can travel over 1,000 kilometers in one day. So maybe to put it into perspective, looking at this image, their wingspan can reach up to 3.5 meters. Or if you just look at one of their wings, that would be the same as my height. So we're talking about an incredibly large, graceful seabird. I'm not going to don't worry about too much of the graph. All you have to know is that when they look at species survival, this is from the IUCN, they give each species an index. And at the top here is when a species is doing much better, so it's surviving a lot more. Whereas down at the bottom, it's really doing not very well. So when you take all bird species, they're fairly stable, but coming down quite slowly. But when you look at ocean-going seabirds or pelagic birds, they really aren't doing very well. This decrease here is predominantly due to fishing and longline fishing. But some of the other threats, Saba already mentioned one of them, is pollution. They just don't understand that pollution is not food. They end up eating it, getting their stomach completely full, unable to digest it, and starve to death. And if they have a chick at that particular point in time, they will pass that through the feeding process to the chick in many occasions. But just to run very quickly, the human disturbance, degrading of habitats, hunting, obviously there's natural causes, and then introduced predators such as mice, pigs, on their islands that eat these birds alive. So many of you may have heard of Gough Island, which is fairly close to where I come from. We have a major mice problem on that island, so it's also one of the major threats. But I'm going to focus the rest of my talk on the fisheries and where I spend my time. So this picture was taken in South Africa about 5 or 6 years ago, when we had very large numbers of seabirds being killed. But globally, we're looking at over 300,000 seabirds that get killed every single year. 15 of them are threatened with extinction, and so we really are running out of time. There is some good news, is that when I first started working, that number was closer to 19 out of 22, so we are achieving something. So as I said, I'm going to focus the rest of my talk on the fishing. So I don't usually dress like this. I'm often the only woman on a boat, not in high heels and a skirt. I often hang at the back of the boat here. I just returned from a trip 2 weeks ago, and the weather did not look like that. We've often had 9-meter swells and 100-kilometer winds, so it's not always glorious and beautiful. But of course there are many days where we spend some time out in the sun, just in the glory of nature and the birds themselves. But as I mentioned, these birds travel very large distances, and in that time they come across many types of fishing vessels. So also we need to have a global approach to the work that we do. There's no point if I'm working in South Africa and someone in Chile is not doing anything, because once the bird leaves our waters, there's a very high chance it will get killed somewhere else. So again, I'm just going to focus on longlining. It's a specific type of fishing, and I'll just explain to you how it works. It's generally targeting high-end species such as tuna and swordfish, and sometimes sharks. Your bluefin tuna can bring a very high price, can be hundreds of thousands of dollars for one fish. So it's a very lucrative business for fishermen. So really you have a boat on the one end, and as it says, you've got this long line of hooks. Whereas I have an example over here. Many of these are going into the ocean. Over 3,000 are set of these on every single boat, every single night. They get set into the ocean, and as they're sinking, they lay there and they catch the fish, and about 12 hours later, they will be hauled back up. In most cases, we catch the birds when these are going down, which I will show you shortly. So just to show you where we fish and where birds are found. So albatrosses are mainly found in the Southern Ocean. They breed mostly on the subantarctic islands. They spend most of their life out at sea, only start breeding when they're 10 years old, and come back once a year, once every 2 years to land. Otherwise, they're solely dependent on the ocean. And if we add where some of our fishing occurs, you can see they very much overlap, and that's where the problem comes in. We're both targeting the same thing. We both want the fish. So exactly how do these birds get caught? As I mentioned, we have thousands of these going into the ocean. Each one of these is baited with a piece of squid or a piece of fish, and that's thrown into the ocean, and that's what attracts the tuna. But unfortunately, that's exactly what attracts seabirds. You can think about it as a seabird either having to make its or find its own meal, or getting a takeaway. This option is a lot easier for them, and they will obviously opt for that over having to search the oceans wide and far for just a morsel of a piece of fish. So you can either get them caught on their wings. As you know, they've got very large wings, or just through the mouth themselves. So as I mentioned, the line goes down, it stays there for 12 hours. The bird really has very little chance of surviving, and by the time it comes up, you get an image like this. Long lining has been known for many years to cause a problem, and that's because we've been able to count the birds coming up. They physically come up. In other fisheries, we are not so lucky. We have to do a lot of observation to be able to see the birds, because they're not brought back on board when we catch them. But in this one, we're fairly lucky. We've got good estimates. So again, please don't be too bogged down in the graph itself. The way we do in science in measuring bird bycatch is how many birds we're catching per 1,000 hooks. So just don't worry about that. This is probably more relevant for you. In the beginning, when we started, we were catching about 1.5 to 2 birds per boat per day. So you can imagine scaling that up into the many thousands of fishing vessels there are globally. But now down in 2013, we've brought it right down to well under half a bird per day per vessel. And in fact, that's a reduction of over 80%. And this is particularly important when we're talking about the foreign fleets. So in many countries, you have your local fleet, which obviously comes from your own country. But you have Asian fishing fleets, such as Taiwanese, Indonesians, Koreans, Japanese, that often roam around the oceans following the tuna. And this is particularly good because in our foreign longline fleet, this is where we've made the biggest impact. And that's important because in many cases, those Asian fleets will be in your waters. They care very little about your nature, your ecosystem. They're very just wanting to get into the fish, that thousands, hundreds of thousands of rands worth of tuna. So this is a great success story within our program. So now you may be wondering to yourself, how have we managed to achieve that? In the longline fishery, we unfortunately have to use many different measures all at once. There's no one single solution currently available. So the first one is by using a fishing weight. That obviously gets your line to sink a lot quicker. And the faster it can sink, the quicker it's out of the bird's reach. But the problem with weights is they're not very safe for fishermen. If you can imagine having a very large shark or a very large tuna on the end of the line, and if the line suddenly snaps, that whole weight will come flying back and has been known to kill fishermen. So although it's good for birds, it's not necessarily good for humans. We have come up with a new design. It's called a Lumo lead, and what it does, instead of flying back at you when it gets that strong tension from the pulling of the large shark or fish, is it slides down the line and uses that as the force going down instead of flying back. It does grip back on the line, so it doesn't go back into the ocean, but I'm not going to talk too much about that. A second way we work with the fisheries is they have to fish at night, and that's pretty obvious. You can't see as much at night time, although there are seabirds that do feed at night, and so unfortunately it does still become a slight problem for those species. And then lastly, we use what's called a bird scaring line or a tori line. And tori is just the Japanese word for bird. It was invented by a Japanese fisherman who was tired of catching birds and losing his bait and not being able to catch the very expensive tuna. And how it operates is you have one main line with these streamers that hang down, generally nice and colourful. They flap in the wind and they operate a bit like a scarecrow. They keep the birds out of the danger area. So you will see here is where the line and the hooks are going down into the water. So it protects them from diving down and accessing that bait and being dragged under with the line as it goes down. Then another measure that's worked really well in South Africa is a measure we call a precautionary catch limit. And all that means is we're giving every single vessel a certain number of birds that they're allowed to catch before they have to stop fishing in our waters. So nobody wants to stop fishing, nobody really wants to be the bad guy. So this has worked really well. It's got that major slope down in that graph that I showed you a little earlier. So in South Africa, the first limit we have is 25 birds per vessel per year. If you don't use your bird scaring line, or you don't set at night, or you don't use your weights, and we have fisheries observers who record this, so we know on a 5-day real time what's happening on these boats. If they don't do that, we can stop them fishing. But if it's maybe full moon and it's very bright and the birds are still able to see the baits, but you're using all your measures, we allow you to continue fishing, but we add extra weight and we give you a second tori line and hope that will make a solution for you. If you again catch 25 birds, so a total of 50, that's your next trigger point. Again, if you haven't complied to all the regulations, you have to stop fishing. But if you have, we put someone like myself on board the vessel, because what we find is often my vessel's terrible and it catches a lot of birds, but my neighbour's vessel is very good. It's often just a little bit about how the individual fishes. So often we know which are the bad boats and which are the ones we need to work on. And that's become a very useful tool for us to be able to bring those boats that catch a lot back into sync. So again, just to run through here, so this red section over here is where we get most of our albatross species, down in the south. And again, I said to you, I'm working here in South Africa, but it doesn't help if I'm the only one doing something. So we have a group of us, a whole 6 teams in South America, 1 in Namibia and 1 in South Africa, mainly in hotspots of where the seabirds are found. But you may also wonder to yourself, what happens into these areas here? Who's looking after those? And that's where the next part of our job comes in, is we need to take the lessons that we've learned locally and take them internationally into places what we call the high seas. High seas are places where no country owns that particular part of the ocean, so there's no real regulations revolving around there. And many of the high seas fleets or Asian fleets are operating there, and they operate on very large scales and have large amounts of hooks going into the water. But we also have to look at new technologies. So I've shown you some of the solutions we have currently, but as I've explained, not all of them are perfect. So we need to come up with new ways to solve seabird bycatch. So again, maybe a little bit of a horrifying picture, which is slightly out of date. This just shows you in a 5 by 5 degree grid how many hooks are going into the ocean. In the red section, there's up to 26 million hooks. Just in that, one of those tiny little blocks over there, 26 million hooks. So we've definitely got our work cut out for us in terms of the larger picture, the bigger scale, the high seas themselves. But that's where I'm pleased to announce that we're starting to make some headway, and the Future for Nature Award is going to be put largely towards this. So I'll firstly speak about some of our new technologies, and I'm hoping at the back you can see, but please, if you can't, you're more than welcome to come after the presentation and have a look. So this is what we call, excuse me, it's just a handle. This is what we call a hook pod. So very simply, again, this is just that hook I was showing you a little earlier. Baited with, this is a piece of plastic squid, but it would be a real squid and knife. What they do is they have one of these already attached to the line, so it's just integrated, it's not anything extra that they have to use. Fisherman then just loads the hook, so that now cannot catch any birds, there's nothing that can get caught on that. And incidentally, it should help sharks and turtles as well as it sinks down into the ocean. Then, what the fisherman would do, is would throw that into the ocean. At a predefined depth, this one we've set to 10 meters, because generally that's what your albatrosses and some of your smaller birds can dive to. There's a little pressure release system inside this device that would allow it to release. Now it can continue fishing. It has many advantages, as I've said. It could affect seabird, turtle and shark bycatch globally. It will save the bait being stolen by seabirds, so the fishermen are more likely to catch the fish that they're looking for. This device itself is reusable. All they have to do is shut it and reload it. There's another fantastic part of it, is it's got the weight inside integrated, so you can actually get rid of this silver bullet that is a safety problem for fishermen. And then just on the inside, you may have noticed when it opened, it has a little LED light inside it. So when they're fishing for tuna, what they often use are those chemical light sticks that many people use for discos these days. And what happens is that only lasts for one set or one night. And many times the fisherman just pulls it off and throws it into the ocean, and it's incredibly toxic. So we've tried to integrate that into this device so that they no longer have to use those chemical light sticks. So if you think about it, this could be a one-size-fits-all or one-stop shop. They no longer have to set at night. They're not going to lose their bait. They no longer have to use weights because it's already integrated in here. They don't have to use light sticks, and they will not have to use a torrey line. So this offers a very good option to fishermen, and in fact is much less costly than any of the other options they currently have. So I've got a colleague who is hoping to leave on Monday to go and continue with the testing of these, but this is largely where the Future for Nature Award money is going to be put towards, getting these into commercial fisheries, and eventually taking them, as we've seen, into the high seas, where our biggest problem and many of our hooks are put. But there is some more exciting news, is that we've already started working. So we've been able to get access to a Korean bluefin tuna longline. And this is the first time any NGO has ever got access on board this fishing vessel. We were on there for 3 weeks. We were able to test, so those leads I was talking about that are safe, that don't come flying back, we were able to test those. And since then, the fishery themselves have voluntarily gone and ordered 40,000 to put on their entire boat. And they are traditionally known for not using weights. So this is a really good example of how they're starting to buy in. And we're finding many times it's not because they don't want to, it's because they don't understand. That's where we have Korean workshops where we go into these countries and go and teach them how to use these devices. So I was in Korea last year and I gave a workshop to the fishermen. And then lastly, from Japan, we're also starting to see some noise. Especially Asian countries, they don't like to be the last one. They like to compete with one another. So because Korea is starting to do some work, Japan's starting to stand up and see that there's necessary need for this. So they've committed that their Indian and Atlantic fleets will be compliant to all the measures that they need to have, so torrey lines and weights, etc., by July 2014, when in fact they only have to do it by 2015 according to the regulations. They've also invited us onto their research vessel where we can go and trial these hook pods and put them to real use in another fishery and actually show them how it's used properly. But ultimately, to end off, this is me on a trip I was on about 3 weeks ago. I'd like to see an area or a time, not necessarily only with fishermen, but where people involved in any animals can have an understanding of why we want to conserve them, not just have to use regulations and make them do it. I want us to all be a happy family where we've got an understanding and they actually want to do it and they want to commit to doing it themselves. And so that one day, whether it's seabirds or frogs or lions, that they can be roaming around the planet and other people, such as the youngsters we saw today on stage, can be able to enjoy them like I've been able to in my life, and be able to get the peace and energy and passion that you can, and be able to hear those sounds we heard in Saba's presentation. So thank you very much, and I hope that you're able to see a bit of my life out of this.